So this week's reflection is based on a passage from Matthew 22, verses 34 to 40. When God first led the people out of slavery in Egypt, he led them to Mount Sinai, where he gave Moses what we know as the 10 commandments. Now, while they were commandments of God, they were actually instructions on how to live as his people. The very first one is, "You shall have no other gods before me." So as his people, they were to put him first. He was to be their first priority. In fact, the first 5 of those 10 commandments are about relating to God, and the second 5 are about how to live with each other by not lying, not stealing, not breaking up marriage, and so on. Over time, God gave more instructions, and these can be found in 2 of the books of the Bible, Leviticus and Deuteronomy. By the time of Jesus, there was a group who were very, very committed to keeping the law and making sure that everybody kept the law. They were the Pharisees. In their enthusiasm, they did a lot of interpreting of the law. For example, one of the 10 commandments is, remember the Sabbath day and keep it for God. You shouldn't work on the Sabbath. So they set about, well, what defines work? And they came up with, if you walk more than a certain number of steps on the Sabbath day, that's seen as work. If you couldn't cook on the Sabbath because that would be work. So what they would do is they could cook a meal the day before and they could keep it warm. But there were very strict rules about how you kept it warm, because some methods would simply keep the food cooking, and that would be work. They were all about working out what you could do and what you shouldn't do. Now, these Pharisees studied the law meticulously. They loved to have discussions about it. And so one day they came to Jesus and they said, "Which is the greatest commandment of the law?" And I'm sure they were looking for a great discussion and probably looking to put Jesus right, according to what they thought. And Jesus' answer to it was, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind." Now that was in the law. It comes from Deuteronomy 6:5. But this is not a law about what we should or shouldn't do. This is all about attitude. Now, if I were a boss, I could order a junior employee to go and get me a cup of coffee, and they could do that. But I couldn't order them to love me. It just doesn't work that way. Love is a response to somebody, and it's not something that you can order. To love God is a call to respond to him. In John's first letter, in chapter 4, it says, "Love comes from God." That's where our ability to love comes from. But how do we come to love God? Because there are many who hate God. They hate God probably because they blame him for some tragedy in their life, or because they see him as restricting enjoyment in life. They don't actually know God, because God doesn't cause tragedies and he doesn't restrict enjoyment. In fact, one of the gifts of the Holy Spirit is joy. How do we come to love God? Our English language is very rich, but it does have some limitations, and one of them is that there are many things that we only have one word for, and one of those is love. There's a popular saying, "Love is love," but what does it really mean? In Greek, there are 4 different words for love. There's eros, which is romantic love. There's phileo, which is love of a friend. There's storge, which is protective sort of love, like a parent to a child. And then there's agape, which is the absolute selfless love of God. As human beings, we're very easy to recognise the eros, the phileo, and the storge. We don't always recognise the agape, the selfless love of God. Jesus came to this earth to show us the love that God has for each of us. He did it by how he mixed with people who were regarded as outcasts, spoke to the woman at the well who was obviously ostracised by the rest of her community, and yet he was willing to take her seriously, talk about the issues in her life, to the point where she was able to run back to the village and tell everybody that she'd met this man that she believed was the Messiah, and they listened to her and believed. He touched and healed people with leprosy. Now, lepers were told to keep away from everybody and they had to call out unclean so nobody accidentally touched them. But Jesus was happy to reach out and touch them. At one point he made the effort to go to a lonely place to be with his disciples, have a bit of peace and quiet with them. But people saw him going and so they headed off. And when he got to this lonely place, there was a great crowd there, all clamouring for him. And it says, when he saw them, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. No one was unimportant to Jesus, and he would put aside his personal time for the sake of others. And yet the greatest example of God's love was shown through Jesus' death. John 4:10, this is the love, not that we love God, but that he loved us and sent his Son an atoning sacrifice for our sin. Jesus was arrested. He was charged on false charges, given an illegal trial because it was done overnight and that was not the legitimate procedure. They took him to the Roman governor saying that he was inciting rebellion against Rome, which he wasn't. Then they mocked him, they beat him, and they beat him with a lash that would tear the flesh off your back. Then they crucified him, which is the most brutal form of death that's ever been devised. And even the Romans eventually said, no, this is too brutal, and they stopped crucifying people. Now, was Jesus just a helpless victim, that once he was arrested, that was it, he couldn't do anything about it? Well, no. If that had been the case, it would have been a case of terrible injustice. But Jesus was not a helpless victim. He was willingly going through all of this. When the soldiers came to arrest him, one of the disciples grabbed a sword and went and actually cut off an ear of one of the soldiers. And Jesus said, no, put that away. He said, do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? But how would then the scriptures be fulfilled that it must happen this way? See, he could have stopped this at any time, but he didn't. He was willing to go through it because he knew that this sacrifice was the only sacrifice that was worthy enough to deal with human disobedience and dishonouring of God. And it was a sacrifice not just for people at that time, but for people of all time. When we realise that God did this for us personally, because his love for each one of us has no limits, then that's when we respond in love with our love. Once we come to that place, we don't need to think about what we are allowed to do and what we shouldn't do, because our desire becomes to please the one that we love.